1.
For American generals are warning that a war with Iran would be hell. Not complicated. Not theoretical. These are not television pundits looking for airtime. They are men who watched Iraq burn, who saw Afghanistan unravel, who counted coffins and wrote letters to families. Now they are looking at Washington and saying something very simple: a limited strike on Tehran could ignite something the United States would not be able to contain. What stands out to me is not the rhetoric from politicians. It's the hesitation from soldiers who have already paid the bill once. According to an analysis published by Foreign Policy, 4 former generals who served in Iraq and Afghanistan are openly questioning the wisdom of striking Iran again. The headline itself reads like a warning flare: Trump's luck may run out if he attacks Iran again. That framing matters. It implies that previous limited uses of force worked partly because escalation was avoided by calculation, and perhaps by chance. But chance is not a strategy. Let's begin with what actually happened. Former senior commanders, men with operational experience in prolonged counterinsurgency campaigns, have publicly cautioned that even a so-called surgical strike on Iranian nuclear or military facilities could spiral. They are not denying U.S. military superiority in conventional terms. The United States still fields the most technologically advanced armed forces on the planet. Carrier strike groups, stealth bombers, global logistics. That is not in dispute. What they are challenging is the assumption that superiority guarantees control. Why are they making this argument now? Because Iran is not Iraq in 2003, and it is not Afghanistan in 2001. Tehran has spent years constructing something different, a layered deterrence architecture built on asymmetric warfare. Instead of relying solely on tanks and fighter jets, Iran has invested in ballistic missiles, precision-guided munitions, drone swarms, cyber capabilities, and, critically, a network of regional allies often described as the axis of resistance. That network stretches across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and beyond. It is designed so that any strike on Iran does not remain bilateral. This changes the equation fundamentally. A limited American bombardment might target nuclear infrastructure. But Iran's response would not necessarily be symmetrical. U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria could face rocket or drone attacks. Maritime routes in the Persian Gulf could be threatened. Allied groups might activate across multiple fronts simultaneously. Escalation would not be a single staircase. It would be several doors opening at once. And here is the uncomfortable part. Washington could light the fuse, but it would not control how many theaters ignite. The former generals argue that any presentation of such an operation as quick, clean, and contained is dangerously optimistic. They have seen short wars become generational commitments. They remember the early briefings in Iraq, how swiftly Baghdad fell, how victory was declared, and how the insurgency metastasized afterward. They remember Afghanistan's initial success against the Taliban and the slow, grinding transformation into America's longest war. The cost was not abstract. Trillions of dollars expended. Tens of thousands wounded. Strategic credibility eroded by wars that were neither fully won nor decisively ended. And yet, there is a political temptation here. Former President Donald Trump has historically favored calibrated uses of force, limited strikes meant to signal deterrence without committing to full-scale war. Strike fast. Display strength. Withdraw. The formula projects power without absorbing all the liabilities of occupation. It is a model built for optics as much as for military effect. But Iran is structurally different from the targets of previous limited strikes. Even if Washington convinces itself that it is launching a precise punitive action, Tehran may interpret it as a strategic escalation demanding a broader response. That is the vertigo in this scenario. Escalation control depends on both parties agreeing on limits. There is no guarantee of that symmetry. Another layer complicates matters further: nuclear calculus. The generals cited in Foreign Policy also question whether a strike would even achieve its intended objective of halting Iran's nuclear program. In fact, it could accelerate it. A military attack might unify domestic factions inside Iran, strengthen hardliners, and provide the political justification to move more decisively toward weaponization under the argument of national defense. So instead of freezing nuclear development, a strike could legitimize its expansion. That possibility shifts the strategic balance. If deterrence fails to deter, and coercion incentivizes acceleration, then the initiating power may end up weakening its own long-term objective. At this point, I want to ask you something. If a limited strike risks regional escalation, fails to guarantee nuclear rollback, and drains political capital at home, what exactly is the strategic win condition? I'm genuinely curious how you see it. Share your view below, because this debate is not theoretical anymore. If you're still here, you're clearly not satisfied with surface-level narratives. You're trying to map consequences, not slogans. Meanwhile, Tehran is not responding only through diplomats. A senior Iranian military figure, Brigadier General Rasul Sanai Rad, political deputy in the ideological office of the Commander-in-Chief of Iran's armed forces, has issued a blunt message. Iran is not Libya. It is not Syria. It is not Venezuela. In other words, intervention templates that worked, or seem to work, elsewhere will not replicate easily here. To understand why that matters, we need to revisit history. Iran fought an 8-year war against Iraq in the 1980s. Hundreds of thousands died. Cities were bombed. Chemical weapons were used. The conflict forged what Iranian officials call the sacred defense. That experience did more than scar the population. It shaped doctrine. It institutionalized resilience. It embedded a national narrative around endurance under isolation and sanctions. From Tehran's perspective, that war was proof that survival is possible under extreme pressure. Sanai Rad also references a more recent episode, the so-called 12-Day War in June 2025 involving the United States and Israel. He frames it as a stress test that demonstrated Iran's capacity to absorb strikes, retaliate, and maintain internal cohesion. Whether one agrees with that assessment or not, the perception inside Iran is critical. If leadership believes it has already endured limited confrontation successfully, it may calculate that it can manage another round. Now consider the military posture. The United States has deployed 2 aircraft carriers and dozens of combat aircraft, bombers, and refueling assets near Iranian waters. That is a visible show of force. But Tehran characterizes it as negotiation theater, a display meant to strengthen Washington's leverage at the bargaining table rather than evidence of imminent invasion. This is where analysis shifts from description to judgment. When both sides treat military deployments as bargaining chips rather than final moves, the risk of misinterpretation increases. Signals meant as deterrence can be read as preparation. Demonstrations can look like preludes. Sanai Rad goes further. He argues that Washington underestimates not only Iran's capabilities but its domestic resolve. He warns that any miscalculation would impose severe material and reputational costs on the United States. Not just damaged ships or bases, but damage to the image of American power itself. And here another geopolitical layer emerges: Israel's role. Iranian officials accuse Israel of pressuring Washington toward harsher assessments and more aggressive policies. From Tehran's vantage point, Israeli security calculations could drag the United States into a confrontation whose consequences extend beyond what American voters or strategists are prepared to absorb. That accusation may be politically charged, but it highlights alliance dynamics. When regional allies feel existentially threatened, they often advocate for maximal responses. The question is whether the patron power shares the same risk tolerance. Sanai Rad also references U.S. confrontations with Yemeni forces, suggesting that even engagements at a smaller scale have revealed vulnerabilities. His warning is stark: if the United States makes a mistake, Iran's response would be decisive and potentially expand into a regional war, or even beyond the region. That is not casual language. It implies activation of a broader map of actors across West Asia. Maritime insecurity, missile exchanges, proxy mobilizations, supply chain disruptions, energy markets reacting violently. So here is the second question I want to leave with you before we approach a conclusion. If escalation spreads across multiple theaters, from the Gulf to the Levant, Are American policymakers prepared for a conflict whose geographic scope they cannot neatly define? Let me know how you evaluate that risk. Diplomacy and deterrence are now running in parallel. Washington threatens strikes if a nuclear deal fails. Indirect negotiations continue simultaneously. This dual-track approach can be strategic, pressure plus diplomacy, but it is inherently unstable. Each side must believe the other prefers agreement over war. If that belief erodes, deterrence slides into provocation. The Islamic Republic publicly insists it seeks diplomatic resolution but will not accept coercion. U.S. generals caution against illusions of quick victory. Foreign policy summarizes the dilemma bluntly: America can start the fire, but it does not control how far it spreads or when it ends. In strategic terms, the United States retains overwhelming conventional superiority. But Iran has invested in escalation complexity. That means the opening move might belong to Washington, yet the tempo and geography of the response could belong to Tehran. History offers context. Great powers often underestimate regional actors with high tolerance for risk and deep defensive narratives. In Iraq and Afghanistan, initial dominance did not translate into durable outcomes. Prestige eroded not because the United States lacked weapons, but because it lacked clear political end states. A war with Iran would not resemble those conflicts exactly. It would likely be faster, more technological, more regional. But the structural danger is similar: objectives that are easier to declare than to achieve. In the end, the potential winners and losers are not obvious. Iran could suffer devastating infrastructure damage. The United States could face regional blowback and strategic overstretch. Allies could be drawn into a widening confrontation. Energy markets could convulse. Global supply chains could feel the shock. The reputational cost alone, if escalation spirals beyond control, could reshape deterrence credibility for years. For American generals are essentially saying this: strength does not eliminate consequence. They have already witnessed what half-finished wars do to institutions and societies. Whether Washington listens is another matter entirely. We can analyze force ratios and missile ranges all day. But wars are not spreadsheets. They are sequences of decisions under pressure, shaped by pride, perception, and politics. And if miscalculation occurs, no one will be able to say the warnings were not issued. That is where we stand. We'll see who believes escalation can be choreographed, and who remembers that once the first strike lands, choreography ends. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're tracking the evolution of this story day by day. Make sure to activate notifications, and don't miss our next report. And remember, you can now become a channel member. If you believe in this project and want to see it grow, your support makes all the difference. If you'd like to support our channel financially, which we greatly appreciate, you can do so through Patreon and PayPal. The link is in the video description.